Welcome to a phenomenal edition of Rebellion's educational series. We have General Patton's grandson, an expert on his grandfather, author, military historian, on to talk to us about General Patton and World War II. Thank you so much for coming on today, Bob.
It's my pleasure, Alex, and I'm happy to answer any questions and just have a good conversation. Looking forward to it.
Okay, so the first question is, how accurate is the movie? That's the question that most of my researchers have been asking me at Rebellion. Rebellion has about 130 researchers, and everyone loves the movie. But in your opinion, how accurate is it?
Well, I've always looked at it as a fantastic portrait of a final product. And that final product was that persona of George Patton, that blood and guts persona that George C. Scott so amazingly captured. That is spectacularly done and deserving of every accolade both the actor and the film got. But from my perspective as a historian, as a family member, and as an interested human being, I'd like to know where that persona, where that creation came from. So I've always sort of looked back on it and said, A+ rendition of the final version of George Patton that history knows, but where did that figure come from? How did it go from a little boy who moved in his ambitions at age 7 from being a fireman to being the greatest general that ever lived, and actually stuck with that throughout his days on earth? To me, that formation, that formative process is where the real richness lies about his character and the keys to his nature, both in terms of military arts and as a person and as a man.
Before we jump in, a lot of questions have been coming to me very specifically about post-war, how he would have fared being on the shelf. He wasn't a man who wanted to be president of the United States. He'd wanted to invade Moscow at the end. Obviously we all know about Bill O'Reilly's book speculating about the death of your grandfather. How did that make you feel, by the way, the Bill O'Reilly book?
I did read it. Listen, he tells a good story, and it sold tremendously, as all of his books do, I imagine. But I think that there's a lot of ambiguity as to what happened to Patton. Personally, our family settled on the idea that the simplest story was, in fact, the true story, that it was an accident, and fluky as it seemed, he broke his neck. All others in the vehicle were fine, but he just happened to be sitting in the wrong place and unprepared for the collision, and snapped his spine and paralyzed really for the rest of his life, which was only, I think, 11 days. So I don't see the assassination, but I do recognize that there are ambiguities. There are moments of time that are unaccounted for. Why, after she'd been at his side for days, was the moment when his wife stepped out of the room, finally to go down to the cafeteria in the hospital, and in that moment he died. Those kinds of things are very, very sort of rich with possibility and dark intent. So I'm never going to say it can't be, but I do think that probably it happened as the story has unfolded historically. It was just an accident of fate. But your question otherwise, Alex, about Patton post-war, what would that have been like? Yeah. I think the key there is to look at World War I. When he came home at age 33 after World War I, he'd been severely wounded. He won a Distinguished Service Cross. He gained notoriety in the very few days of fighting that he had. He was very perilously engaged in war, but not for a long time. He got wounded pretty quickly. But he predicted in letters home at that time that he would be miserable between the wars, that the excitement, the level of intensity at which he'd been living with the American Expeditionary Force and with the new tank corps that he helped found, he said, I'm just not going to be very much fun to live with after that kind of excitement. Well, I think if you take that point of view, and let me tell you, he had his difficult period between the wars, but now let's move to World War II and the level of intensity that he was living there as a 4-star general, as commanding the Third Army, and what was it, 26 divisions, I believe. That kind of intensity. As he wrote home, he said, I've been living as a kind of demigod. Imagine letting that go in one fell swoop and coming home and sitting on your porch. So In my family, and my late aunt, who died in 1994, knew him probably better than certainly than my father even did, said that he would have been a very, very difficult man to be with after the wars. And she said he probably, all of his bad habits probably would have returned, and he would have just groused about history and groused about politics and groused about why he wasn't more famous than he was, and probably, you know, drunk too much and put his feet up and finally just been an old pisser by the end of his life. So in a way, fate was kind to him, if we can say that, by taking him, you know, into the next world when it did in 1945.
And I mean, your own father was a 4-star general.
Two-star. Major general. Yep.
Major general. It's amazing. It's to have such a rank. So between the 3 continents, you know, Africa, or not the 3 major campaigns, sorry, not continents, Africa, sure, Italy, and, you know, France, which would you say you're most fascinated by?
Oh gosh, I think it's interesting. That's a really good question. I've never been asked that before. I think I really would have to divide them up for their strengths and what they showed about Patton. If we look,
they're each so individual and interesting. Each one enthralls me, to be honest. I couldn't pick a winner.
You know, listen, of course, you know, that dawn, as Rick Atkinson has called it, that dawn of the American intervention in North Africa in 1942, you know, when Patton was the commander of the Torch invasions. And he really was able, in the earliest days of American involvement, to put in practice what he'd been frankly practicing for and dreaming of for a couple of decades between the wars. So to see him do that in that action is really interesting from the point of view that it was an inaugural for him as well as for the American forces.
You think of him as a military innovator?
Yeah, for sure. I think that he, of course, he would have said his innovations came from study and from understanding the past. He really, he spent a lot of time, Alex, looking at, for example, the ancient wars. What roads, what pathways did the Roman forces use when they were moving across Europe? He said they would have looked for the most efficient ways to cross the rivers, to cut through the valleys, whatever it might be. So he used his fascination, lifelong erudition in ancient history and in warfare to say, I'm going to use these ancient commanders, these ancient armies as my template to move forward. So he innovated off of that base of tradition and understanding the past. But tactically, he was a huge innovator. Maneuver, he hated, full frontal attacks. He said they're too costly, and I would always prefer to get behind the enemy. We're sort of jumping around here, but one of the stats that I've always thought was very revealing of his innovation and his tactics was that the Third Army captured more enemy than any other unit of its size in that theater. Now,
I didn't know that stat. That's a huge stat.
Why do you capture that? Why do you capture the enemy? Why does the enemy surrender? Because they can't escape. Because you're behind them. And that ability to as General Schwarzkopf reiterated when he did, Desert Storm, as Patton said,
I knew General Schwarzkopf growing up, actually, from Telluride, Colorado, and General Schwarzkopf idolized your grandfather and would, speak of General Patton with such admiration. So even as a young child, to see, Schwarzkopf, who was a little bit of a demigod in the early 1990s in the U.S. himself, frankly.
But think about that campaign. What did we do there? While we were watching the buildup of that, there was all these news stories about this great buildup that we were doing on the border of Kuwait, and all the newsmen were there, and it was going to be a full frontal attack, just roll. And all that time, they didn't know that way to the west, Schwarzkopf had put an entire tank units upon tank units where they could move very quickly and get behind the front lines that were defending of Iraqi forces and Republican Guard that were defending Kuwait. And that was very much Patton's dictum, which was grab them by the nose and kick them in the ass. In other words, take up all their attention by grabbing them in the face. Meanwhile, you're reaching around to kick them from behind. And that really was the heart of his tactic, was to maneuver behind the enemy. And that's why that statistic about all the hundreds of thousands of enemy that the Third Army captured tells you all you need to know about what he believed in, which was to use maneuver to minimize the costly slog of frontal attack, and simply frontal attacks to hold down the enemy and then get behind them with force. And that's why people surrender. So that's really the heart of his innovation. And that comes out of an understanding really of maneuver, as we said, and also very specifically of horse cavalry. One of the innovations that Patton came up with, and it seems very mundane now, is to equate the use of armor, the use of tanks with speed and firepower. And initially, when they were introduced into war in World War I, they were called land ships. And they just thought the tanks would be convenient for the infantry to hide behind while they all trudged forward. And that's what tanks were. They were basically moving cannon that you could hide behind. But as between the wars, particularly, he began to understand, and he wasn't the only one. Eisenhower was part of it, a very famous innovator in armored tactics named Aiden Chaffee. They got together and they said, what is armor really going to be its maximum effectiveness? Use it as horse cavalry was used. Either concentrated attack at a point of attack or maneuver and get behind. And that's making that what seems a simple logical leap now was not recognized early on in the early conceptual days of tank warfare. Who got a hold of it first? The Nazis. Blitzkrieg was very much based on that. Patton studied Blitzkrieg. He was fascinated with the idea of total war, air and land and artillery and maneuver to overwhelm enemy armies. He thought it was an amazing feat what Blitzkrieg had done, and he said, this is the future of warfare, and he was right.
Wow. So if you had to answer why Patton beat Rommel, would your short answer be that, or would you want to expand maybe a little bit?
Oh gosh, he beat Rommel for one reason, because Rommel at the time they met had been really taxed in that theater. He had had great victories against the British at El Alamein and elsewhere, and he had gained his well-deserved nickname as the Desert Fox. But nothing, not to take away from Patton's when he took him on and defeated him, but Rommel had been in theater, had been short of supplies, and had really been running on the sheer force of his own leadership. And ability to maneuver in those deserts to keep the panzers really active and threatening. So Patton came in with sort of fresh forces and an overwhelming power, but above all, he learned from Rommel. He learned what Rommel did well. He tried to understand where Rommel's weaknesses were, largely due to logistical issues that the Nazi and the Wehrmacht were having in North Africa at that time. And he was able to beat him on the field, both with the purposes of his own tactical ability, I'm speaking of Patton's, but also he did have the advantage of a fresher and a better supplied force at that time. But again, this was a great conflict between two obviously preeminent warriors.
Yeah, I mean, right before Patton came in, we were not doing well though in North Africa. In fact, one of Rebellion's editor's grandfathers was almost killed in a tank in the battle a week before your grandfather took over. And
Yes.
Actually, the day after, when the medics were going through and taking out the bodies, they found him, 90% dead, and he somehow managed to survive. But yeah, it's amazing how your grandfather turned that around. So let's jump to Italy now. What stands out to you about the Italian campaign?
Well, again, he was specifically in Sicily, which was sort of that was the toehold from which they imagined that they would then launch into the invasion of the Italian mainland. So he was in Sicily. He got his second Distinguished Service Cross during the beach landings at Sicily. And the movie really captures it as well as I could tell, where he really showed at that point that that speed could win the day on the battlefield. So while Montgomery was going up the east coast of Sicily, slogging through and great heroic battles up that coast, Patton took the long road around to the west and then along the northern coast of Sicily. And if you looked at a map, you'd say, this is crazy. He's going to be just taking himself out of the action. He's going to be weeks late to the fighting. But he recognized that speed could get there. And again, he could get behind the enemy and cut off their retreat to the mainland. And that was his modus operandi always. What can maneuver do to beat the enemy faster, more violently, and in so doing, hopefully save American lives?
Do you think he regretted the slap?
Oh, God, sure he did. Of course, in today's army, he'd have been cashiered right out. But, listen, we can all understand, I think, even those who would say it was an unforgivable sin to strike a subordinate like that. And it was. We can understand the pressures that he felt himself, under. He had been touring a lot of hospitals that day. He had been committing a lot of young men to die in battle. And so to tour a field hospital and to find among the physically wounded men whom we now understand to be just as grievously wounded mentally, through PTSD and our understanding of the shock of battle, etc. He just wasn't able to process that in any other way except to be furious. So as a person, I can forgive him for that, and not that he needs my forgiveness, but as I regard his standing. On the other hand, I can say that was a terrible mistake, and certainly he would have agreed with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, but also from an efficiency standpoint, as a utilitarian, if someone has PTSD, they should just be removed from the battlefield. And I understand not wanting to mix them with hurt.
You're exactly right. And this is the understanding that we've gained now, over time. But listen, these are pressures that men like Patton, right, and also men on the very front lines, like people we all know and our relatives and all the rest. These are pressures that are so hard to understand and process if you haven't been there. So I always am reluctant to judge from too far afield. We aren't there, we weren't there. But I think the Sicily campaign is particularly important because to move to the third part of your question, the European theater. How do they all stack together? Well, as a result of him slapping the soldiers, he was relieved of command in effect because he had been the front runner to run the Normandy invasions. The Germans expected him to be the leader that would do it. The Allies expected that Patton would be the man to lead the invasion of Normandy. But because he was in such trouble with the press and with a bad reputation that had gone back to the domestic front, people wanted him sent home. People wanted him fired. Eisenhower at least was wise enough to put Patton to the side. And they used him, of course, on the famous ruse where they created a false army around him and led the Germans to believe that the attack would in fact come more to the north at Calais. Yes. And that was, so by being in the doghouse, in effect, as a result of the slap, he was able to still perform a great role in the Normandy invasion, albeit not one that he would have liked. He would have preferred to have been in the action. But then once he got ashore and once Eisenhower decided that his abilities with maneuver, with leadership, with just sheer will to advance was the right guy to help them break out of the hedgerow country and do that end run around the southern flank of the German forces in France and to drive them back across the Rhine. So that's really where he became famous. And then his greatest moment certainly was in the Battle of the Bulge, when he anticipated by several days that something was going on. He said, something is going on to the north. I've got to be ready. We're starting to get strange indications of a possible counterattack. Nobody knew quite what was coming, but he began to lay the logistical groundwork to pull out of a battle and move to the north to relieve Bastogne and to hit the flank of that German counterattack. So that was his greatest moment, and was really the moment where he could put everything that he had learned from childhood study through his youthful studies and his youthful experiences in the military, through World War I, through study between the wars, and he was then finally able to put it all to perfect effect in the Battle of the Bulge.
Very much so. And I guess one of my last questions would be his feelings with Monty. Would you say?
Oh, I think again, the movie has it right in this regard, that they both were very, very egotistical. The movie calls them both prima donnas, and as Patton says in the movie, at least I admit that I'm one. Monty won't admit it. So listen, they were very much sort of two peas in a pod in a lot of ways, but I think tactically they were very, very different. Montgomery was for a slow moving, full front, north to south.
Some say that Monty's love of turtleneck sweaters inspired Steve Jobs. I mean, who knows if that's true?
It's who knows. Right now Steve Jobs has probably inspired a lot of other people, probably a lot more people to the same black turtleneck. But listen, Montgomery was a certain kind of commander with huge responsibilities that few of us can ever really understand. They had a different philosophy, though. Again, Montgomery thought that front across Europe, moving steadily, just driving like a kind of pile driver, moving the German forces slowly back into Germany and just push them back toward Berlin. Patton said, no, let's spearhead, let's get behind, let's move, let's use our air power and our superior logistics at this point and drive them both from a frontal attack, but more importantly, get behind them and drive to Berlin. And had he been allowed to do that, because of course, as we all know, he was pulled back for using, they kept him from getting all the fuel that he wanted. He wanted to just spearhead right to Berlin and just decapitate the enemy right there. And had he been able to do that, think of the possible liberations of the concentration camps that might have happened even weeks earlier than they did, and could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, from the murder machine that Hitler had put together. And so there's always this idea that maybe speed would have saved not only American lives, but would have saved the lives of the civilian population, and particularly those who were, particularly the Jews who were, held in those concentration camps. Patton wanted to get to Germany now. And he said, let's not worry about what's happening on our flanks. We can defend our flanks. Let's spearhead to Berlin and get this done. That was not the philosophy that was taken. And he was
many
the man
did die at the end.
Pardon me?
Many inmates at the concentration camps did die near the very end. And so those weeks would have been important.
Yeah, that's when the killing really revved up there, which is just unspeakable to imagine. But yes, in the last months of the existence of the Third Reich was when the real, the wholesale mass slaughter of the Jews and others who were in those camps, took place. So every day that would have been moved to victory would have been many, many, many lives saved.
Why FDR did not bomb the camps will be a question for history forever.
I think so.
Personally, I don't. Yeah. As someone, as a Jewish individual who, quite frankly, lost a number of my family members in the Holocaust, I will wonder about that forever. But speaking of the Holocaust,
I'd love to tell you a little anecdote that I had regarding that, because Patton, as he was really falling apart psychologically at the very end, particularly after he got relieved, again, for impolitic remarks after the war, after the VE Day, after the victory had been declared, and he was relieved of the Third Army. He said some things which were somewhat out of character for him, some anti-Semitic things, for example, which are they're in his diaries. We have some really unfortunate and ignorant things that he said. But I once gave a speech about Patton in New York City some years ago, and a younger gentleman brought his very elderly, whether aunt or grandmother, to meet me afterward. Often you have exchanges with people that have been listening to you. And he came up to me and he said, listen, I really appreciate that you want to be honest and show General Patton with all of his flaws and understand his greatness, understand his challenges, and understand that he had some bigotry to him, and we need to understand him in full context. But my grandmother wants to say something to you. So here's this little old lady who comes to me, and she says in her broken English, she says, I was in the camps. And she showed me her tattoo on her arm. And she said, I understand what you're trying to say about your grandfather, and be honest on some of his bigotry, etc. But he gave his life to save me and my people. And he said, and I will always honor him for that. And I hope you won't forget that, to me. And I felt very, very humbled that she was large enough of heart and of spirit to say, yes, he was flawed. He came of a different world that would have looked at someone like me as just an other that I don't understand. But he literally gave his life to defeat Hitler and to liberate camps. And to me, that's for those who will knock Patton for this or that kind of archaic point of view on some social issue. I always say, but he ultimately lived and died for the right values, and I'm proud of it for that.
Warren Buffett says you trail any man for 500 miles and he'll be getting some tickets. Your grandfather was the single greatest individual contributor towards defeating Hitler and winning World War II, and is a legend that inspired myself and countless other soldiers in the U.S. and around the world. So, Bob.
Well, he believed in his soldiers, as did my father. I always think my father was more like a master sergeant with a couple of stars on his shoulder, whereas General Patton of World War II fame was really born to that cavalier kind of style, with the shiny helmet and boots, and that was his leadership style, and it worked for him. And he put that together piece by piece, beginning as a little boy. And that's why, again, to circle our conversation back, the movie is a fantastic rendition and portrayal of the final product. But Patton built that persona bit by bit, from a little boy who was insecure, had dyslexia, and was kept homeschooled until he was 12 years old. And out of that came this swaggering, confident, commander and leader. And he simply built that persona piece by piece. So as a family member and as a historian, I find that to be really one of the most fascinating aspects of his character.
Fantastic. I have no doubt he's hanging out with Teddy Roosevelt right now watching this.
Well, Roosevelt comes out of the same origins of a kind of a pampered, sickly, delicate youth, and turned himself into quite the opposite.
Indeed. Oh, indeed. Indeed. Well, this has been an excellent experience, and I couldn't be more thankful, Bob. Thank you so much for coming on today.
I appreciate the invitation, and to all of you who are listening, you know, history is such a wonderful and rich place to learn about ourselves. So what you do by making history and making it current is a great service to all of us, and I appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All righty. Take care.